Well, I'm going to speak on Platonism and Islamic mysticism. I've discovered a secret war. It's actually the longest raging war in the history of the world. It's a war on which everything depends, literally everything, especially the very idea of things. It's been going on for 2,300 years. Previously, it was fought out everywhere west of China and north of the Cameroon. Now, after William of Ockham and the two Bacons, it is fought out quietly, cheek by jowl, in spire-topped or ivy-covered universities. Its combatants wear tweed and corduroy and wool in the winter. They fight zealously for very little money. Their bombshells are paperbacks. Their captives are the minds and hearts of unwitting students, and their prizes are entrenched positions in universities. It's the war for Plato and Socrates. The combatants. There are two camps, the camp of Aristotle and the camp of Plotinus. Plotinus, not Plato, as people like Richard Thomas have argued, for Plato can be found in both camps. Formidable figures have fought on opposing sides, St. Augustine versus St. Thomas Aquinas, and Farabi versus Ibn Rushd, Ibn Gabirol versus Maimonides. One side claims the conquests of empirical science, reality, logic, scholasticism, the Enlightenment, the modern world, the future, and the universe itself. The other side claims understanding the truth, wisdom, Boethius, the Renaissance, heaven, the Hermetic, Orphic, Pythagorean religious past of Europe and the Mediterranean, and the soul itself. No small claims, to be sure. The late Oxford Don R.M. Hare summed it all up well when he divided Platonic scholarship into Platonists and Latinists. The Platonists are basically the new Platonic mystics in their schools. Plutarch, Plotinus, Porphyry, and Proclus, apparently having a P in your name is a prerequisite to be a member of the school. The Latinists are those Platonists who focus on empirical knowledge, science, the mind, politics, inquiry, and so on, starting with Plato's own students, Aristotle, and Speusippus, his nephew and successor at the academy. The Latinists have no doctrine of forms, eidos, of the heart, of mysticism, or of the supreme good. The Platonists have no doctrines of embryology, biology, physics, or chemistry. Both sides contest knowledge, epistemology, logic, mathematics, ethics, anthropology, and of course, philosophy itself. There's a lot of personal vanity involved as well, if I may say this. The Latinists want to feel that they're the true intellectual elite of the world, doing the philosophy that underpins the whole modern world. All they have to do is be very clever and do a lot of reading and contemplation, which to them means thinking, ratiocination, and syllogisms. What they absolutely do not want to admit is that Platonism is a religion, which might mean that they actually have to do something in practice. And that Plato and Socrates practiced a lot of pagan rites, prayer, fasting, and abstinence. The Platonists themselves are rather divided. All agree that the Socratic method involved questioning, which, like a Buddhist koan, leads to mystical intuition, and ultimately, mystical contemplation of beauty. Porphyry claims that this was his teacher Plotinus' spiritual method, although Plotinus himself seems to have done a lot of fasting, sexual abstinence, and vigils as well. But they're rather confused as how to deal with the pagan prayers of Plato and Socrates, as it is in both the Symposium and I think Phaedrus. There are basically two schools. The recreation school of Iamblichus, which tried to rehabilitate the whole Greek religion and pantheon, and even Socrates showed from that in Phaedrus, and create a theurgy. And then the Graph school. The Graph school, like Shabdi Sohrawardi's Illuminationism, Sohrawardi this is the uncle Sohrawardi. He was executed by Salah ad-Din for his pains. Salah ad-Din was busy fighting with Richard the Lionheart and didn't want Sohrawardi messing with his son's mind. and Marsilio Ficino, who sort of recreated the Christian Platonist school. He died 1499. He was much better treated by the patrons, his patrons, the Medicis. You know, the Medicis were generally much more cutthroat, and even Saladin, who was a warrior. Now, one could mention people like Thomas Taylor, the Platonist, the British poet William Blake, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and contemporary groups like the Temenos Academy. But basically, the options are the same. Graft Platonism on another religion, or try to recreate the Greek religion. And to be frank, apart from some great poetry and nice translations, none of these give optimal results. Successful practice of Platonism, pure and simple, seems to have ended with Proclus. We should admit that. Their devotional secrets are lost. So if the Platonists can be accused of vanity, the Platonists can be accused of being in vain. Yet still the war continues. Secrecy of the war. The one thing that both sides agree is to keep the war under wraps from the rest of the world. I suspect that both sides know very well that if the rest of the world really understood that academic philosophy is ultimately secretly about nothing else than this one war on all fronts, philosophy wouldn't be taught anywhere, and all the combatants would lose their jobs. Fortunately for them, however, it takes 20 years to go through carefully through Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus, to say nothing of Proclus' commentaries or Ficino's, and 30 years to do so in ancient Greek. And anyone who commits to this is already hooked, so there's no one to call them out with authority. Alfred North Whitehead famously said that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Perhaps what he should have said is that it is a series of footnotes, deliberately misunderstanding or misinterpreting Plato. The Platonic opera. Now, having spent years gone through all of Plato and all the Apocrypha, and having visited Delphi, where Socrates was pronounced the wisest and freest of the Greeks, and the Agora, and the ruins of the Academy, where Socrates and Plato respectively died and were buried, let me weigh in as an enthusiastic but amused spectator. First, the Platonic corpus, whilst lots of fun to read, unlike Aristotle and Plotinus, both of us have said, is a veiled text, or rather a dance of many veils. These veils basically consist of 5 obstructions to understand the text. A, remoteness of time, place, language, way of life, circumstances, and technology. B, polytheistic and confusing Greek mythology. C, repugnant Greek pederasty, which neither Socrates nor Plato seem to approve of, but which keeps creeping in as part of Greek life. D, the casual language of the dialogue form. And E, not or rarely giving answers, but merely leading the reader to work out the truth for himself through parables or through the Socratic method of eliciting truth and provoking mystical intuitions through questions and answers, called elenchos in Greek, leading to aporia, bewilderment, and occasionally resolved deus ex machina by appeals to authority from figures like Diotima or Diotima, Parmenides, and Socrates himself. Second, the Platonists are correct that the Platonic corpus of works systematically addresses every conceivable philosophical question. To make this clear, let me just go through the main dialogues as I've noted them. Of the early dialogues, the main theme of the Apology of the Soul, of the Charmides temperance, Crito ethics, Euthyphro piety, first Alcibiades self-knowledge, Hippias major intention, Hippias minor fineness, Iron inspiration, Laches courage, Lysis friendship. Of the middle dialogues, Crapless language, youth theme. Those of you who know Greek, please excuse my terrible pronunciation. I'm sort of autodidact, so I never get the pronunciations right. Orthoidemus, argumentation, gorgeous, the good and happiness, Meno, learning, Phaedo, death, Protagoras, virtue, symposium, love. The later dialogues, Republic is justice, that was even the subtitle of the Republic. The Parmenides, oneness, Theaetetus, knowledge, Phaedrus, mystical experience, and the rhetoric. The late dialogues, Timaeus, the physical universe of creation, Critias, history, sophist, being and sophistry, statesman, leadership, Philebus, pleasure, laws, the law. On the apocryphal shorter dialogues, Menexenus, funeral orations, Cleitophon, the Socrates challenge, Axiochus, facing death, definitions of virtues, Demodocus, advice, Epinomis, it's actually appendix to the laws, on numbers, it's very important. The epistles on method, Erexias, wealth, Halcyon, miracles, Hipparchus, greed, Minus, revealed law, on justice, virtues, can virtue be taught, rival knowledge is on general versus self-knowledge, second Alcibiades on prayer, Sisyphus on deliberation, Theages on wisdom versus political wisdom, and the epigrams are various sort of aphorisms. Now these are just the primary topics. In each of the dialogues you find many other topics nestled. Anything you can think of is covered in Platonic. It's just amazing. Third, the Platonists are also correct. The corpus is full of mystical passages, and these seem to be the apogee of the whole opera. These include such beautiful passages as Daphne's mystical speech in the Symposium. And I've listed these for students, both this and the ones before, because it's very useful. I mean, if you read Plato 3 or 4 times before you understand what the dialogue is about, once you have the key, you can just read it once. So I'll just give you the Stephanus numbers. Stephanus, as I'm sure you probably know, Stephanus was this monk who carried out the translations. So he gave numbers which had nothing to do with the chronological dating. So I'll just give you the segments of the various passages. So in the Symposium, in the Phaedrus, you've got the allegory of the soul, the heavenly vision, and that's 245 to 254. You've got the soul itself in the Philebus, temperance, 506 to 508, and death, 523 to 524 in Georgius, and Amnesis, and the afterlife in the Phaedrus, 76 to 118, and the bursting forth of intellection of the mind in the 7th letter, 342 to 344, creation, Timaeus, God and realization in Theaetetus, the sun, the line of knowledge, the oasis, and the underground cave, the Republic 507 to 511, 514 to 520, and philosophy itself in the Republic 610 to 621. Now those are a corpus of mystical passages, properly speaking. And there's also, of course, some very mysterious passages in Parmenides, Sophists, and Statesmen, but you get the picture. Most of the major dialogues lead to a mystical passage. That the Platonists and the Platonists are both correct. It's clear, as Aram had pointed out. What is not clear, and perhaps it takes a Muslim to say this, is that I think Plato deliberately meant the two to be inseparable. Mysticism begins from the mundane, and without knowledge of the world, mysticism would not have a place to exist or flourish. As his misadventures, his personal misadventures in Syracuse seem to show. Moreover, in order for his dialogues to survive, and being himself, well, Plato, he no doubt could see that nothing would come of the Orphic and Pythagorean teachings because of the way they were transmitted. So his own writings would have to contain more than that. They would have to contain both kinds of knowledge. They would also have to be artfully crafted and investigative and interactive and not formal and doctrinal. In this, he was supremely successful. I think the war between the Platonists and the Platonists was Plato's plan for Platonism to survive. After all, his own model of the soul in the Phaedrus is a charioteer controlling 2 horses pulling in opposite directions. The soul also was the model for the politeia, the public. And it's not a stretch to think that he modeled the whole earth on the soul, because after all, the oracle at Delphi said, know thyself. Now, Islamic mysticism. There's another war going on, not academic war, with even more vigor, but this is than the war of Plato, albeit it's only half as old, it's 1,200 years. And it was started by John of Damascus, who died in 749. John had been the chief administrator under an Umayyad Muslim caliph of Damascus, but he hated Islam and started a polemical war against it. And that is a war that continues today, not so much in universities anymore, but in churches and the media. For various reasons, this war maintained a persistent hatred for the Quran, the Sharia, and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, but not for Islamic mysticism, Islamic art, and Islamic philosophy. So the solution was simple enough. Show that these last three elements had a different source other than the Quran, the Sharia, and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And that way, liking them was justified. I suspect there might be a hint of this, or a need for clarity on this, on the very title I was asked to talk here today about. Indeed, earlier this year, a close friend of mine, a Christian theologian, asked me to write something from the standpoint of view on happiness. And I said, listen, I write a lot from the standpoint. Can I write it from the point of view of Platonism? He said, what's the difference? I said, well, the difference is the Quran. So let me start by saying that Islamic mysticism, Sufism, is based entirely on the Quran, the Sharia, and the Sunnah, the custom of the Prophet. If you look objectively at the magnum opera of Islamic mysticism, Ghazali's Ihya al-Din and Rumi's Mathnawi, you'll find that they're both systematic commentaries on the doctrines, rights, vices, and virtues according to the Quran and the Sunnah, and that they both insist on the Sharia in punctilious detail and explain its more profound meaning. This is even true of the more controversial magnum opus of the Andalusian mystic Ibn Arabi, in Futuhat al-Makkiyah, and even any work of Sufism with any currency in the history of Islam. Moreover, all the great Sufi orders, Tariqa, Shadaliyya, Ba'alawiyya, Qadiriyya, Naqshbandiyya, Madhawiyya, Chistiyya, Rifa'iyya, and their offshoots, all trace their systemization back to Abdul Qadir Jilani or Junayd al-Baghdadi. All trace their roots back to the Prophet through either the Caliph Abu Bakr or the Caliph Ali. Junayd's own student, Abu Bakr Shibli, famously threw at the execution of Hallaj, he threw a rose at him, proving the sentence, the death sentence, but understanding the mystical statement. Indeed, to this day, all traditional mystic orders adhere to the Quran and the Sunnah and the Sharia strictly, and that is the very criterion of their authenticity. What is the difference, we should ask really, what between Islamic mystics, Sufis, and ordinary Muslims? Basically, as argued in Ghazali's Minhaj al-Abidin, as one of the summaries of the Hayat revival of religious sciences, is a question of frequency, intensity, and intention. The increased frequency, which, in addition to the usual rites and practice of Islam, manifests itself mostly in the constant invocation of God. God says in the Quran, of all things, the remembrance of God is the greatest. In order to purify and awaken the heart, the order of both spiritual knowledge and love, and it has its origins in the Holy saying, Hadith Qudsi. This is God's saying, God's speaking. Nothing is more beloved to me as a means for my servant to draw near to me than the worship which I have made binding on him. And my servant ceases not to draw nearer to me with added voluntary devotions of his own free will until I love him. And when I love him, I am the hearing with which he hears, the sight with which he sees, the hand with which he grasps, and the foot with which he walks. That's in Bukhari. It's a very authentic definition. This, of course, implies the cardinal virtue of sabr, which is persistence or endurance, patience, and for increased, as it were, voluntary devotions. As for increased intensity intention, this basically consists of watching one's own ego as every whim through the cardinal virtue of taqwa. Taqwa means fear and awareness of God, constant vigilance. These two virtues, which are essentially comprised doing what is good and avoiding what is bad, must be combined. When they are combined, they lead to ihsan, perfect virtue, and to a person being with God, as it were. God says in the Quran, so be patient and practice, and your patience is ordered by the help of God, and do not grieve for them, nor be in distress because of what they scheme. Truly God is with those who fear, alladhina taqaw, and those who are virtuous, muhsinin. It remains to be said that ihsan itself is synonymous with perfect intention worship. In the famous hadith of Jibreel, the Prophet ﷺ defined ihsan as to worship God as if you saw him. For even if you do not see him, yet he sees you. The uniqueness of Islamic mysticism. As regards the Prophet's own spirituality and mysticism, whilst it naturally shares some characteristics with Judaism, Christianity, and Platonism, it's also startlingly new and unique. I'm sort of running out of time.
No, I'm not. No, you're fine.
All right, so I'll go through them.
Yes,
I'll
absolutely.
go through some of the points. The Prophet, number one, the Prophet didn't read or write, and therefore had no access to Platonism, which is, or any Platonic text before him. He had no contact with any Platonists, and there is no record of any contact with Jewish or Christian mystics. Two, it was the Islamic mysticism, the Prophet's mysticism, was characterized by concentration on the unity of the one God, quite different from Trinitarian Christianity and the Greek pantheon. Three, the Prophet was married at the age of 25 and remarried many times later. And this is quite different from the celibacy of Christian monks and from Platonism. Fourth, the Prophet's periods of solitary retreats in the cave of Hira were always balanced by activity in the world, and even political and military activity. And these two are quite different from Christian monks and from Platonists. Fifth, the Prophet was, as a young man, a caravan merchant, earning his livelihood with his own hands. And this is also quite different from Jesus Christ or even Moses. Sixth, as seen in the Quran, the Prophet contemplated nature deeply, in particular the ayat, the signs of God in the desert, in a way that is unseen in both the Bible and Platonism. Seventh, there's a great deal of emphasis in the Quran on the next life and its realities in a way completely unknown to Judaism up to that point, and much more explicitly than in the Bible. Even though there's a hadith in Muslim, hadith 2577, that God says it is only our actions that are stored up for us in the next world. So we understand what's happening in the next world, all things, all these are our actions in their reality. Eighth, the oneirogy, in other words, the science of visionary dreams of the Prophet can be both literally and symbolically true. Whereas the oneirogy of the Bible is symbolic, the oneirogy of Plato is literally true. The Prophet saw everything that would happen to him every day for 6 months before he became prophet. He saw it like a film, he saw it every day. And then also in the Quran, you've got things like Joseph's dreams, which are symbolically true. So you've got both kinds of knowledge. You don't, and that's a kind of new thing. 9, the Prophet has invocations for every occasion. Getting up, going to the bathroom, drinking, eating, going to sleep, and so on. And constant invocation. And this seems to balance between Jesus is saying not to repeat prayers in Matthew 6:7, and Paul saying pray without ceasing in Thessalonians 1:17. 10th, the revelation of the Quran, unlike anything in the Bible, was continually interactive with changing circumstances, and it was answering different questions over 23 years. Yet it forms a stylistic and substantial unity not found between the books of the Bible, or even within the books of the Bible. 11. The Prophet was blessed with a night of the descent of divine revelation and grace, that's Laylatul Qadr, and a night of physical ascent into heaven, Laylatul Isra, reflecting human effort. And this doesn't exist in Platonism, and brings together two separate situations in the Bible, such as Moses' revelations and Jacob's ladder, perhaps, in an unprecedented way. 12. The night of its ascent itself had 2 stages: the horizontal journey to Jerusalem, and then the vertical journey to the highest heaven, taken to symbolize the perfecting of the soul and the spirit, the less and greater mysteries, perhaps, in a way completely unprecedented. I could go on, but you see the picture. The Prophet's mysticism has some similarities with what has gone before in Platonism, Judaism, and Christianity. And this is to be expected because the Prophet said that he is not a novelty among messengers, or the Quran said he's not a novelty among messengers. But we put something together and sums it up in a unique way. Moreover, this is also to be expected because Muslims have identified Hermes Trismegistus with the Prophet in Arabic. Minna will know about this because in Arabic goes on about this. who was called, of course, was Enoch and Idris in the Quran. And the 40th surah, the 40th chapter of the Quran, clearly shows an enduring but secret believing tradition originating in ancient Egypt. This is a super Mortally, all the similarities that exist were not learned by any historical worldly transmission. There are no roads or casual links leading from either Judaism, Christianity, or Platonism, their mysticism, rather, to the Prophet. There are no roads. Their mysticism, there's no from St. Anthony, there's no from Maximus the Confessor, there are no roads leading to the Prophet. And it's high time that Western scholarship took note of that. Nor are there any roads leading from these traditions to Islamic mysticism. The Bible was not translated into Arabic until the 9th century. After some study, I found that Plato and Plotinus were not fully translated into Arabic until the 18th century. All that existed in Arabic was Al-Farabi's summaries of the major Platonic dialogues, and parts of Timaeus, the Phaedo, the Crito, the Laws, and the Republic. Parts of the Aeneids were translated, but they were attributed to Aristotle as the theology of Aristotle. But this is, they're from the Aeneids, which is why Muslims mistakenly tended to believe that Aristotle was a mystic as well. They were reading from Aristotle. What made Plato so prestigious that even a Hanbali jurist like Ibn al-Jawzi would be quoting Plato was widespread popular books like The Wisdom of the Philosophers, which attributed a lot of wise, Islamically compatible sayings to Plato and to Socrates. But you would be, if you looked at those books, you'd be hard-pressed to source them either to Plato or Plotinus. If there are any roads coming out of Platonism, they are roads to Christian mysticism, not to Islam. An origin of Alexandria's master, as you all know, was Ammonius Saccas, who was Plotinus' own master. Indeed, you can trace a very direct road from Islamic mystical eschatology, with the levels hell, to later mystics like Dante by Andalusia. And even though Christianity came before Islam, the mysticism from Islam influences Christian mysticism, not the other way around. And also, this is true as regards Judaism, because Jewish mysticism is a later phenomenon, as you know. So where does that leave us as regards mysticism? It leaves us with only one possible conclusion, that there is a polygenesis of mysticism. That is to say that mysticism in general occurs and recurs quite independently and with no necessary connection to other instances of mysticism. How else to explain the mysticism of Adi Shankara, who died in 820 CE in Kerala, only 150 years after Prophet ﷺ, before Islam had penetrated into India? Shankaran mysticism is of a very similar kind to certain kinds of Sufism, as Prince Dara Shukra, who was the son of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, pointed out in his typological study, Majma' al-Bahrain. How else, moreover, can you explain mysticism occurring in ancient Taoism and Zen Buddhism, and possibly elsewhere in the world? So, the third war. This brings us to the third war I want to discuss here. It's the war over mysticism in general. Unlike the first war, it hasn't determined the course of history. Unlike the second war, it hasn't led to anybody being killed or real physical conflicts. And so I suppose it should be called a struggle, and it's only 200 years old. First, however, let me say what I mean by mysticism. I don't mean a nebulous, arcane, or a dubious cult-like Sethianism. I mean the practice of extra voluntary devotions and asceticism in the hope of leading to the highest possible religious spiritual experience. Without proposing a strict typology, which is really beyond scope here, it is enough to say that mystical experiences seems to have the following four recognizable features. One, the experience of the absolute unity of God in the spirit, during which the individual consciousness, or at least self-consciousness, is temporarily annihilated. The imprint of that experience remains on the soul for the rest of a person's life. Some of this can be expressed in words, and this leads to cataphatic mysticism like Meister Eckhart, and some cannot. And this leads to so-called apophatic mysticism like Super Dionysius and like the Cloud of Unknown. 2. The annihilation of the ego and the desire to do evil lead to virtue and self-mastery as both a prerequisite and an effect of mystical experience, enhanced after the experience. 3. Contemplation of spiritual realities and divine secrets. Mystical, miraculous powers and events are often reported. Now, people tend to dismiss these miracles, but they're very well attested. St. Francis of Assisi, standing in the air, it's very well attested. People, okay, it's not true. But these are very, very well attested in all the different mysticisms. 4. Influx of spiritual love and knowledge, gnosis properly speaking, leading up to and arising from the mystical state. Now, I know this conference is on love and mysticism, but the more I thought about it, the more I really can't see a difference. The difference of emphasis, I've put it here. The difference between love and mysticism is only a matter of emphasis, for the supreme mystical state, be it in Islam or other mystic traditions, involves both. Indeed, the subtle heart is the organ of both love and knowledge. And I found this, interestingly, in Maximus Confessor's 400 chapters on love. He says that when Jesus Christ himself, when he said, blessed are the pure in heart, he meant the mind. So Maximus uses the mind, but he uses the nous. So he says the same organ. More interesting still, in the Quran, it's the same reality. But the word heart, qalb, is used for the organ, but for the process, the word aqala, is used as a verb, but it's the same organ. Aqala is the process, qalb is the organ. But it's love and knowledge both. The basic methods and rites of seem to be centered around 6 strategies. 2 are positive, 4 are negative. The 2 positive ones are prayer and contemplation, dhikr and fiqh, as we say in Arabic, and they engage the mind, the soul and the mind respectively. The 4 negative ones are fasting, vigil, solitude, and silence. In Arabic we say قلة الطعام, قلة النيام, قلة الأنام, قلة الكلام. The first 2 weaken the hold of the body on the soul, and the second weaken the hold of the ego on the soul. Together they engage the whole human being and try to awaken the divine spirit. The maxim oration jejunium is a simplification. It's too much of a simplification. The polygenesis of mysticism. Turning now to what to make of the polygenesis of mysticism. It should be said that this question was only asked in the West after the Enlightenment, and when people began to have real access to religions of their own. And when the misery of the Industrial Revolution made people search for some kind of spiritual religion. They also began noticing that as different as the various religions were, their mysticisms had a lot in common. It's been claimed that a number of notable intellectuals, mostly Renaissance figures, all postulated a perennial philosophy at the heart of all religions associated with mysticism. These are said to include Nicholas of Cusa, Ficino, his student Pico de Mirandela, and Agostino Stoico, and the mathematician Leibniz. But it seems to me that this is a case of wishful thinking and pedigree exaggeration by the people who claim this, by the later perennialists. It seems to me that Nicholas, who was a cardinal and a papal legate to Jerusalem, was trying to find theological solutions for peace with the Protestants on one hand and the Muslims on the other. That Ficino was simply a Christian Neoplatonist. That Pico was a Christian Neoplatonist who read and loved Arabic and Hebrew. And that Stoico, who was the Vatican librarian for 4 years, was more about bringing classical learning in line with Christianity than any kind of perennialism. And that Leibniz himself was a philosophical deist. That he believed in God, but via philosophy, not religion. Prosaically speaking, then, the study of mysticism as an autonomous phenomenon can be said to begin in earnest in the 19th century. Without going into different developments and figures, let me just say that the study can be divided into 2 different categories. Believing explanations and disbelieving explanations. People believe that this is true, this people don't. The disbelieving explanations have produced 4 kinds of explanations. Number 1, that they're hallucinations related to drugs or bodily chemicals. Number 2, that they're manifestations of madness and neurosis. Number 3, that they're manifestations of a powerful subconscious. Freudian, Jungian, or otherwise. And this is notably argued by William James in his seminal book, Varieties of Religious Experience, 1992. And number 4, that the friends from Romania will know a lot about, because that they are all explanations, because this was championed by the Romanian philosopher Marcia Iliade, and it's the idea that the mysticism is an expression of universal human desires, which gives rise to myths. Of the believing explanations, there seem to be 3 schools of thought. Number 1, that there's only one real religion, that's mysticism. And so we can ignore the rites and syncretize whichever we please. And this was really made famous and sort of exploded by Aldous Huxley in his book, the 1963 book, The Perennial Philosophy. And I suspect that much of the modern hippie movement can be traced back to that. And also, it's got the same concern with drugs. Huxley believed in drugs. And it's basically, and that's where the word spiritual, you know, so I mean, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. So that's where I think that comes from. And so number 2, that all religions have mysticism, but our religious mysticism is better than yours. And this is the approach by sort of Happold in his influential study of mysticism, study of anthropology. And number 3, the so-called tradition school of writers like the Frenchman Guénaud and the Swiss writer Schorn. This school of thought produced a lot of thought, a lot of books, and it interestingly argued that whilst all religions disagreed and contradicted each other in their forms, which they called exoteric forms, they agreed in their mysticism, which they called the esoteric substance of religion. They delivered also withering critiques of the modern world, and myself, in my youth, I read all their writings. I knew a lot of their religious and their leaders, especially the late Martin Mings, who was a saintly man as ever I met. And it has advantages. The advantage of the school is that it generates a lot of goodwill for other religions if people accept it. But it does seem to me that its very premise, means that it is in danger of creating a new religion that no religion at all accepts, since no religion accepts its premise, which is that all religions are equally valid. Moreover, and so it winds up conforming to no religion at all. Moreover, it's a composition fallacy, it's a logical composition fallacy, to argue that just because one part of the religion is true, in this case mysticism, that the whole religion associated with it must be true. Logically speaking, what's true for one part is not true for the whole. I might also add that the depictions of this, of other religions in the school doesn't reflect the reality of those religions as I've come to know them in the last 20 years of religious dialogue. So what to do with all this information? So I'm just finishing.
You're absolutely fine.
So what to do with all this information? As a Muslim, I believe that the wisest thing is the classical Ash'arite position of affirming our religion, our own religion, respectfully differing with other religions, and reserving judgment on the fate of any particular individual. After all, who are we to limit or judge God's mercy? That is a matter surely for God, and we had best consign it to God. We call this direct tafweed. That's it, Scots. Moreover, Ash'arites, as can be seen in Ghazali's Face of the Tafriqa, make a distinction between God's promises, wa'ad, and God's threats, wa'id. God is always bound by his promises, but he isn't bound by his threats. If you have children, you'll know this. If you do this, I'm going to whack you. Of course, you never do, but you just, you still love them, but you make a threat because it has a purpose. So we're not saying that they don't happen. We're just saying that he isn't bound by them. Also, the soul has there's a lot of complexities that you can't understand. Now, this applies a fortiori to individual mystical experiences. Who can really judge which ones are authentic, which ones aren't? Our typology, with our typology, we can perhaps see that certain ones are supernatural and certain ones are spiritual. But we can't be 100% certain which have reached this supreme mystical state. the mystics had a lot of debate about this. We call this now Fath Mutlaq, the unlimited, clear, open. And you can't be sure about who will attain salvation in the end. This theological Ash'ari position finds philosophical precedent in my favorite work of Islamic philosophy, Al-Hayy bin Yaqza, a live son by Andalusian scholar Ibn Tufayl. Al-Hayy is a story of a boy who grows up alone in a desert island and is brought up by a gazelle. After a while, the gazelle dies, and Al-Hayy is forced to contemplate creation and life and the world around him. He concludes that there is a creator who made everything. Eventually, he concludes also that the creator cannot be found in the material world. Eventually, at the age of 49, he retires to a cave, and he contemplates until he has the spiritual opening, as it were, and he comes to have mystical knowledge of God. After that, he discovered that some people come from the mainland, and they persuade him to visit civilization. At first, he doesn't understand the need for religion at all. But then, having seen people living together in civilization, he concludes that religion is absolutely necessary, and he goes back to his, and it's the only way for people living in civilization to discover what he discovered inwardly in solitude. So in short, mysticism may be something endemic to the human soul. We have to reserve judgment. But for the rest of us, we have to get on with the hard business of religious practice. Such an attitude of deferent cautiousness might not only resolve this one issue, but the two other age-old intellectual wars that I mentioned earlier. Finally, it seems to me, if I may say so, that this idea is nestled within Jesus Christ's saying in the Bible, Spiritus Ubi Spirit, which Paul quoted. The wind blows where it wills, and you hear the sound thereof, but you do not know whence it comes, and whither it goes. And so it is with every man born of the Spirit. Allah, thank you.
Beautiful timing, thank you. And very grateful